The presidential campaign is heating up or melting down based on your perspective. Republicans are tripping over each other to see who can run furthest to the right. Now, that's typical in a Republican primary, and the shift to the right has a long history. That includes a lot of Democrats who have switched sides. A new book called Exit Right goes into the history of that. A short time ago, Rich spoke to the author of that book, Daniel Oppenheimer.
Well, let's start, I guess, from the 30s and how a lot of maybe the Stalinists and the communists and some of that thinking helped shape what we saw in the 60s. Talk about how really its birth became in that portion of history.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for us, even in the aftermath of the recession, to appreciate how transformative the Depression was for this country. So we're sort of trucking along, and then the Depression hits, and it just knocks everyone for an enormous loop. And one of the things that happens in the aftermath of that is not just the Communist Party, but all sorts of sort of Marxist parties and Marxist and communists and socialist intellectuals kind of find an enormous boost as a result of the Depression, and particularly American intellectuals are drawn to one or another form of Marxism and communism. So, for instance, Whittaker Chambers, who's one of the guys who I write about in the book, made a little bit of a name for himself as a writer of communist-inspired fiction, and then was tapped by the Communist Party underground to be a spy. So he ran spy rings in New York and D.C. for most of the 30s. Another guy I talk about, James Burnham, who came from this very privileged background, grew up in a wealthy suburb outside of Chicago, went to private school, went to Princeton, and then off to England, and had this whole life laid out in front of him of being a literary critic and a philosopher and a kind of philosopher gentleman. And then the Depression hit, and he, like so many other people, looked for answers, looked for new kinds of systems or theories to explain what was going on, which was like nothing he'd ever experienced. And he became attracted to particularly to the Trotskyist brand of Marxism, and was a Trotskyist for the 1930s. And that had enormous influence. I mean, these people had enormous influence both as left-wing intellectuals, and then, with many of them, ultimately as right-wing intellectuals. So both Whittaker Chambers and James Burnham were among the founding editors in the 1950s of National Review, of William F. Buckley's National Review, which is probably the single most important conservative publication in America of the 20th century.
Was it as simple, Daniel, as some people say, hey, you know, show me a kid who's not progressive in their teens, early 20s, versus when they get older and they're paying the mortgage and they'll become more conservative? As simple as that? Or, I mean, as you go through the book here, some of the bitter blood feuds from people who used to be best friends who literally testified against each other. Why such rapid transformations?
Yeah, I like that line. You know, if you're not, I think it's if you're not a liberal when you're under 30, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're over 30, you have no brain. Which nobody knows who said that, by the way, though it's been attributed to Winston Churchill, but I think he didn't say it. I think it's not as simple as that. I think there's examples certainly of people. We get older. You know, I've in the last 10 years, I've had kids. I have two. I have a third on the way. I have more responsibilities, and there's no question that I, like many people, become conservative. And in more ways, you become more focused on your family and less focused on the kind of the good of the society. And absolutely, that's true, but one of the things I was trying to do in the book, and I think for the most part the stories in the book bear this out, is show that it's not that simple at all. You know, when you care about something deeply, whether it's politics or religion or Eastern philosophy or whatever it is, and you embed that deeply into your identity, it is not an easy thing to just flip on a dime and say, oh, hey, it looks better over here, or my income is higher and I don't want to pay taxes. It actually can be pretty traumatic, and certainly for the people in the book, for most of them, it was a deeply traumatic thing. And it was these belief structures that they had dedicated a lot of themselves and who they were and what they cared about to began to fall apart for one reason or another. And in a lot of cases, they went into a real deep crisis.
Obviously, one cannot listen to any debate on the Republican side without hearing Reagan's named with the most reverence here. But the book does a great job. I found it fascinating. The Reagan as a young man versus the Reagan that the conservatives today, you know, hold as a holy grail. Talk about his transformation.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't know much about Reagan. I'm not sure if I knew anything about Reagan as a liberal before I started researching the book and reading about him. His father was a die-hard liberal Democrat, huge fan of Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, his father worked for one of the offshoots of the New Deal during the 1930s, and Reagan inherited that and really embraced it and had a, extraordinary emotional connection, as so many people did during the Depression and World War II, to Franklin Roosevelt, and one he never actually was dismissive of, that he held on to for his entire life. And so up until the late 1940s, early 1950s, he was a solid liberal Democrat. The transformation happened for a few reasons. One was he became more interested in this issue of communism and anti-communist. He dealt with some communists in Hollywood and the sort of Hollywood left, and he sort of attached himself to the anti-communist cause, which during that period of the 40s and 50s became more and more a conservative cause. So that was part of it. Another big part of it was he went to work for General Electric after his film career stalled. He hosted this is early 1950s, he hosted the weekly TV show of theirs, and he was also their spokesperson, and he traveled around the country speaking to employees and civic clubs and Rotary clubs, and GE at the time was engaged in what may still be the most comprehensive political campaign that an American corporation has ever waged. That was anti-New Deal, anti-labor, very conservative. They didn't require that Reagan believed those things, but he started to sort of absorb that idea during that period. And he also, to go back to that idea of getting older and more conservative, I think that happened to him fairly naturally.
I wonder if he could secure a nomination in today's thing, but that's for another day. Well, as interesting as it is the times we live in, how things got shaped with this new conservatism, if you will, a fascinating read as well. Exit Right, the people who left the left and reshaped the American century. Daniel Oppenheimer. Daniel, I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
We'll be right back with your Hudson Valley headlines right after this.